Hey guys, tonight we're stepping aboard the most famous ship in maritime history, the RMS Titanic. You walk up the gangway, suitcase in hand, as sunlight glints off polished brass and fresh paint. The ship looms like a floating city, with 4 massive smokestacks slicing the sky, and a deck so long it seems to curve with the earth. Stewards in crisp uniforms usher passengers aboard, while a band plays cheerily nearby. There's a crackle of excitement in the air, as if everyone here believes they're about to take part in a triumph of human engineering. The Titanic isn't just a ship, it's a statement, a brag, a big floating middle finger to the laws of nature, and you're on board. But you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and the local time in the comments. I always love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your cabin smells faintly of fresh paint and expensive furniture polish. If you're lucky enough to be in first class, you've got a private suite with electric lights, a plush bed, and even a call button to summon room service. If you're second class, the quarters are neat but modest solid wood furniture, maybe a sink, shared bathrooms down the hall. And if you're in steerage, well, let's just say the mattress is stuffed with straw and the walls are sweating. Right from the start, your class ticket is more than a comfort rating, it's a survival percentage. Historians still argue whether the ship's design ever really prioritized safety or just luxury. But what's clear is that Titanic carried only enough lifeboats for about half of the people aboard, just 20 lifeboats for over 2,200 passengers and crew. And they weren't even filled properly during evacuation. The math doesn't like your odds, especially if you're below deck. It's the 10th of April, 1912. As you wave goodbye to the crowd in Southampton, you're surrounded by eager faces. The wealthy elites are heading to New York to shop, explore, or show off. Immigrant families in steerage Irish, Scandinavian, Eastern European are chasing the American dream, clutching everything they own. A few might be fleeing war, poverty, or even arranged marriages. It's a boat full of stories, all hurtling toward a terrible ending. The ship is so smooth, you barely notice the motion as it leaves port. There's a brief scare when the Titanic's departure causes another ship nearby to break free of its moorings and nearly collider. Close call brushed off with nervous laughter. Fun fact, the near miss happened because Titanic displaced such a huge amount of water that it literally yanked other boats around like bathtub toys. You settle into shipboard life. There are scheduled meals, deck strolls, even squash courts and a Turkish bath for the well-heeled. One quirky tidbit, there was a printing press aboard that published a daily Titanic newsletter, complete with gossip, stock reports, and sports results. You might have read it while lounging in a deck chair, sipping tea under the North Atlantic sky. Titanic was meant to feel more like a floating hotel than a mere vessel. Comfort was king. But here's the thing, no matter how dazzling the chandeliers or how courteous the waitstaff, Titanic is still a ship in the middle of an icy ocean. There are whispers of icebergs to the north, but no one seems worried. The general attitude? We're too fast, too big, too well built to be sunk by something as boring as ice. The confidence is palpable. So is the hubris. And if you listen carefully, beneath the clatter of silverware and the piano music, you can feel the engines thrum. 4 days in, you're slicing through the Atlantic like a knife. The weather is oddly calm, flat seas, cold air, perfect visibility. So perfect, in fact, that it lulled everyone into a false sense of security. No one expected disaster to creep up so silently. That night, you're drifting off in your bunk when something odd rumbles through the ship. It's not loud, no dramatic explosion, just a soft scrape, like a fingernail dragged across the hull. Then stillness. Utter calm. You yawn and roll over, assuming it's nothing. But the ship is already dying. Seawater is spilling through the lower decks, icy and relentless, filling compartments like a silent killer. The engineers know. The officers know. But up here, in your cozy cabin or crowded berth, you're still in the dark. You wake the next morning, maybe just a few hours later, rubbing your eyes as the distant thump of boots and the muffled clang of metal reverberate down the corridors. There's chatter outside your door. Maybe a steward's knock. Maybe not. If you're in first class, Someone's gently suggesting you dress warmly and report to the upper deck as a precaution. If you're in steerage, no one tells you anything. You hear whispers, scuffling, someone laughing nervously, and then nothing again. The Titanic isn't listing yet. Everything feels normal. Too normal. That's what makes it eerie. You head out, and if you're lucky or nosy, you catch sight of an officer talking in hushed tones. They use strange phrases: bulkhead breach, 4 compartments flooded, lifeboats being readied. But the words don't mean much yet. The ship is so massive, so lavish, so alive with light and steam and motion, that the idea of it failing seems laughable. Now let's talk about class. Not like English 101, but social class. Titanic didn't just carry passenger sit, carried a snapshot of Edwardian society carved neatly into 3 vertical slices. First class was the elite. Dukes, countesses, millionaires. Their cabins looked like luxury hotel suites, complete with fireplaces and private promenades. Some even brought their dogs. Not kidding, there was a whole kennel on board. You might see someone walking a Pomeranian along the deck, while wearing diamonds and a feathered hat that could double as a glider. Second class was your rising middle class. Teachers, journalists, small business owners. Their dining room looked nicer than most land-based restaurants. They even had a library. Still, there was no question they were a step below. Then there's steerage third class, where things get real. You're likely sharing a cabin with strangers, sleeping in bunks stacked 3 high. There's one sink for a hallway of people. The food? Functional. Boiled meats, potatoes, no fancy courses. But if you were fleeing poverty or persecution, even that felt like a blessing. Plus, the crew let third-class passengers dance and play their own music. For a moment, it could almost feel like freedom. But this hierarchy isn't just about comfort, it's about escape. When disaster strikes, class turns into a death sentence. Historians still argue whether the crew intentionally blocked steerage passengers from reaching the upper decks, or whether the labyrinth of corridors simply made escape impossible. Either way, the numbers speak volumes. About 62% of first-class passengers survived. Only around 25% of third class did. The difference was metal gates, crew priorities, and good old-fashioned social ranking. You climb the grand staircase and pass through first-class spaces you might have only glimpsed before. Mahogany paneling, crystal chandeliers, and silk wallpaper surround you. But there's no one lounging now. Some folks are in their nightclothes, some in life vests over dinner jackets. There's confusion everywhere, but still, not enough panic. After all, the ship's not even listing, not visibly. The band's still playing. One quirky little detail here. That band? 8 musicians who kept playing even as the decks tilted. Most people think their final song was "Nearer, My God, to Thee," but historians still argue whether that was actually true. Some survivors claimed it was a waltz. Others just remember music fading into cold, black silence. You reach the lifeboat deck. There's a flurry of activity now, officers shouting, stewards carrying children, lifeboat ropes creaking as they're swung out. But here's the gut punch. You glance at the boat being lowered and see it's only half full. They didn't practice. They didn't prepare. Some officers feared overloading the boats. Some didn't even know how many people they held. And some passengers? They refused to get in, thinking it was safer to stay on the Titanic. That's how confident people were in this ship. It would take nearly 2 hours for anyone to really believe she was sinking. By then, most of the lifeboats were already gone. And you? You're still trying to figure out where you belong. Are you supposed to stay? Go? Wait for instructions? Is your class even allowed on this part of the deck? Imagine how surreal it is. One moment, you're in a heated smoking room discussing stock prices. The next, you're on a tilted wooden deck, trying to decide whether to trust your life to a rope and plank contraption dangling above an endless ocean. And let's not forget, it's freezing. You can see your breath. The North Atlantic in April isn't just cold, it's death cold. The water sits at around 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Hypothermia sets in within minutes. You wouldn't even be able to scream. Some lifeboats launch. Some jam. One swings wildly and dumps its passengers during loading. Officers fire shots in the air to stop crowding. There's even a story still debated about an officer who may have shot himself after giving the order to lower a lifeboat. And while all this unfolds, you're standing there with your life vest tight around your chest, staring at the horizon for a ship that's not coming. Other ships did receive Titanic's distress signal. But the nearest one, the Californian, was either confused, asleep, or didn't understand the urgency. Historians still argue whether the Californian could have saved hundreds more had they acted quicker. But no matter how much you will it, no help is arriving just yet. You don't know it, but there are just 2 hours left. Now, whether you're huddled in steerage, clinging to the railing on the boat deck, or pacing inside a saloon wrapped in denial, the mood around you shifts sharply. Officers are no longer just politely firm. They're barking orders. Life jackets are being thrown out like party favors. And yet, people still hesitate to put them on. It's hard to grasp that this floating palace could turn into a floating tomb. You head downward for a moment. Maybe you're searching for someone, or maybe you're just trying to avoid the crowds up top. Either way, you find yourself in the bowels of the ship. This is where things get claustrophobic. The corridors down here are narrow, twisting, and unfamiliar. Steerage passengers are now pressing against locked gates. Mothers shout in languages the officers don't understand. Some crew members, to their credit, try to guide passengers upward. Others just vanish. And the water? It's here now. Not a rush. Not a cinematic geyser. No, just a steady, rising, sloshing chill that laps over your shoes and sends a pulse of dread up your spine. You've probably never felt seawater that cold before. It seeps into your bones like it's trying to turn your blood into slush. And this is just ankle deep. If you slip or fall into a flooded stairwell down here, there's no coming back. Now's a good time to mention the engine room. You don't get to see it, but just a few decks below you, men are shoveling coal into furnaces with steam pouring around them, even as seawater creeps closer. They're staying at their posts, trying to keep the power going so lights don't fail and wireless messages can keep firing into the void. Many of them know they won't make it out. That's their version of heroism unseen and unrecorded. Quirky side note, some third-class passengers brought their own food on board, not because they had to, but because they didn't trust English cooking. You might pass someone clutching a sack of sausages while trying to find their way up. A strange, oddly human image in the middle of a growing nightmare. You finally push upward again. The staircases are jammed now. Some of them lead to dead ends, blocked by crew who haven't received clear instructions. There's shouting. One officer screams for women and children. Another just shoves people aside. This isn't like the drills you've seen in movies. This is chaotic, confusing, and totally improvised. Titanic had done a lifeboat drill the day before sailing, but it was cancelled at the last minute. Why? Still debated. Maybe the captain thought it would worry passengers, or maybe they were just behind schedule. And now? No one really knows what they're doing. You finally break onto the boat deck again, breath clouding in the air, ears ringing from voices, clattering wood, the occasional gunshot warning, and the tilt. Oh, the tilt. You notice it now. Not steep, just enough to make your balance shift forward, enough to make loose objects roll toward the bow, enough to turn denial into sheer dread. The lifeboats? Nearly gone, and most weren't filled to capacity. Boat number 1 left with only 12 people aboard, though it could hold over 40. One boat rowed away with an officer who forbade survivors from going back to rescue those in the water. Historians still argue about him. Was he a coward, or just trying to prevent panic? You may never know. Some boats did return, others didn't, but you're not in one yet. You hear the band again. It's faint, warped slightly by the wind, but still there, still playing. Some survivors say the musicians never even tried to escape. They simply kept going until the end, soothing panic with violins and cellos. Others suggest they tried, but were too late. The truth's probably lost to the sea. You head toward the stern now. The front of the ship is clearly lower. The water's eating it. Windows smashed, corridors flooding, lights flickering. There's no more gentle sway underfoot, just a steady, increasing tilt, like the world is sliding forward, and you're standing on a giant seesaw. You pass a clergyman leading a prayer circle, a mother tying a scarf around her son's head, and whispering that everything will be okay. A man calmly adjusting his tie. One couple sits in deck chairs, holding hands. It's surreal how calm some people are when everything collapses around them. And then, the lights flicker again. You know what that means. You don't want to admit it, but you do. The engines are failing. Power is going. The orchestra's gone silent. The tilt deepens. You grip the railing so hard your fingers cramp. One last glance around you reveals it all. Half-loaded boats vanishing into the dark. Passengers crying out. crewmen trying to maintain some last shred of order. The great Titanic pride of the White Star Lignée becoming a ghost. And you? You're still on board. You cling to the railing, your breath sharp against the icy air, the ship groaning beneath your feet like a wounded creature. It's just past midnight now. You can't see the iceberg anymore, just a growing sense that something is deeply, terribly wrong. Every second drags like it's wrapped in molasses, your muscles aching with each slight adjustment to the tilt underfoot. Above you, lifeboats swing and creak in their davits. Not many are left. You watch one lower shakily with only a scattering of passengers aboard, mostly women. Some crying, some calm, some clutching babies like porcelain dolls. And around them, a ring of men holding back or trying to, while others press forward, voices raised. "There's room! Let me through! My wife is down there!" It's not lawlessness yet, but it's cracking. Here's the twist. Most of the Titanic's officers weren't trained for this. Sure, they'd had lifeboat instructions, but not this level of chaos. The ship had state-of-the-art Marconi wireless equipment, but very little in the way of crowd management protocols. Historians still debate whether better drills, clearer orders, or just more lifeboats might have changed everything. But standing here now, watching a lifeboat half full swing out over the abyss, you realize something gutting. No one's coming to save you. You'll have to figure that out for yourself. If you're a man, forget it. Unless you've got a child in your arms or a famous last name, you're staying behind. Crew members begin enforcing the women and children first rule more strictly now. Some even fire warning shots in the air to keep men back. Others reportedly let certain passengers sneak on. Wealth has its loopholes, even during shipwrecks. One whispered story tells of a man disguising himself as a woman to board. Another rumor historians still argue its truth suggests a first-class passenger bribed a sailor for a lifeboat spot. You try to keep your footing as you move toward the stern. The tilt is subtle but unrelenting, like you're on a playground slide stretched across a football field. Every 10 steps you take feels like 20. A steward barrels past you with a lantern, eyes wide. "Get up! All the way to the back! She's going down bow! First!" You don't stop to ask. You just run. And below you, the third-class passengers are still trapped in a bureaucratic maze. Not locked in, that myth's mostly Hollywood, but they are blocked by crew with mixed orders, by gates that require keys, by hallways that twist and bottleneck and flood. You remember passing a young Irish couple earlier barefoot, arguing softly about whether to go up or wait. You wonder if they made it out. Probably not. Statistically, third-class passengers had the lowest survival rate of all. Another eerie detail. The ship's designers were on board. Yes, Thomas Andrews, Titanic's chief architect, was sailing on this voyage. He was last seen handing out life vests and urging passengers into boats. Not panicking, not fleeing, just helping. Witnesses said he refused to leave, even when begged. The captain, Edward Smith, was still on deck, silent, jaw tight. Some say he went down with the bridge. Others say he swam to a lifeboat and chose not to climb in. The records blur. The truth is buried in ice. You finally make it to the poop, deck the highest point left above water. The bow is gone now, swallowed by the sea. One of the funnels leans at a crooked angle, groaning like a skyscraper about to fall. Water surges over the grand staircase dome. Glass shatters. Screams mix with the sound of rushing water and steel twisting like a crumpled can. And then the lights die. 1 second you're in the dim glow of electrical bulbs. The next, darkness, utter black. You hear a groan ripple through the crowd. Not from the ship, but from the people. Because when the lights die, hope does too. You brace yourself as Titanic lurches. You're lifted, yes. Lifted into the air as the stern rises higher and higher. People cling to railings, smokestacks, anything. Some jump, some pray. Some can't decide. Then it happens. The break. With a sound no one ever forgets. The ship splits. Not like paper, but like bone. The stern, where you stand, detaches from the bow with a shudder that shoots through your feet like an earthquake. One half sinks immediately. The other, still clinging to buoyancy, slaps down flat before rising again like a cork. You grip the railing, heart pounding, throat raw. People slide past you, some screaming, some silent, all falling into a sea that might as well be made of knives. You're still on the ship. For now. You still have choices. For now. But the water is coming. You don't remember making the choice to jump. One moment you're clinging to the railing with frozen fingers, and the next, you're airborne, flung either by panic or the upward lurch of the stern as it reaches a near vertical angle. There's no time to scream. The air punches the breath from your lungs. You hit the ocean like a stone. But instead of sinking, you're jolted back to the surface, limbs flailing in water so cold it feels like it has teeth. Your body doesn't shiver, yet it seizes. The shock steals your voice, stiffens your muscles, and makes your skin feel like it's peeling away from the inside. The sea around you is not silent. It is alive with chaos. People thrash, scream, beg, float. Some wear life jackets. Others don't. Many can't swim. You see a man clinging to a deck chair, eyes wild. Another strikes out in a breaststroke, only to vanish moments later. Debris bobs all around you, suitcases, wooden panels, shattered furniture. You grab onto something, maybe it's part of a table, maybe a stair rail, and cling like your life depends on it. Because it does. Let's talk temperature. The Atlantic that night was roughly 28 degrees Fahrenheit, or 2 degrees Celsius. Below freezing, yet not frozen thanks to its salt content. At that temperature, hypothermia isn't a matter of if, but when. Historians estimate that most people who entered the water died within 15-30 minutes, many sooner. You're already losing feeling in your toes. Your hands begin to numb. Your jaw trembles not from fear, but because your muscles are spasming in protest. If you're still breathing, you're lucky. For now. Then, above the water, you see the Titanic's stern, rising like a beast rearing before it dies. Against the star-filled sky, it looks surreal, beautiful even. The propellers glint in the moonlight, before disappearing beneath the waves. And then, like a curtain being drawn, the ship vanishes, just like that. She slips beneath the surface with a deep sucking moan that pulls air and water and sound down with her. For a moment, it's almost quiet. Then comes the scream. Not one, hundreds. A collective wail of disbelief and agony. From every direction, people call out not just names, but prayers, curses, pleas for mothers, for help, for air, for God. It is the sound of mass death in real time, and you are in the center of it. Now the lifeboats. The few that escaped the sinking are bobbing farther out, lit by a few flickering lamps or the pale glow of the moon. They hear the screams too. They see the floating bodies. But only one boat returns to the wreck site to look for survivors. One. The others are too afraid of being swamped by the drowning, of tipping into the same fate. Historians still argue over the morality of that moment. Was it cowardice? Strategy? Triage? You're not interested in the debate. You're just trying not to drown. You shout, hoping someone will hear, but your voice is barely more than a gasp now. Your lips are turning blue. Your arms cramp. Someone bumps into you, another swimmer, and you cling to each other for a few seconds before the cold separates you both. You don't know who they were. You never will. There's a piece of debris nearby, a flat wooden panel, maybe part of a cabin door. Two people try to climb on, but it flips. One drowns, the other hangs on like you do. That famous scene from the movie? It's not just a tearjerker, it's based on truth. Several survivors were pulled from pieces of wreckage hours later, drifting alone in the dark. But those were the exceptions. The vast majority died within minutes, their bodies quietly going still as the cold claimed them. And there you are, floating, freezing, fading. Your thoughts drift to warmth, a fire, a bed, the way your fingers used to move without stinging. You think of family, or you think of no one. Some people hallucinate in the final stages of hypothermia. Some feel warm as their core body temperature drops. Some simply fall asleep. You do your best to stay awake. You kick. You whisper. You blink up at the stars. They're shockingly bright. The sky is impossibly clear. And then a miracle. A light. Dim at first. Then brighter. You squint, thinking it's a dream. But it's real. It's a ship. The Carpathia, responding to the Titanic's SOS, ploughing through the icy waters toward your location. She left as soon as the distress call was received, racing at top speed through dangerous ice fields. But it took her over 4 hours to arrive. For you, 4 hours might as well be a lifetime. By now, most of the screaming has stopped. The ocean is littered with bodies, floating silent in their life jackets. Frozen, peaceful. You blink slowly, barely holding on to consciousness, as a lifeboat drifts closer. A voice faint, English, maybe Irish, calls out. You raise a hand. Or maybe you think you do. Hands reach down. They haul you in like dead weight, and for a moment, everything goes black. When you come to, you're wrapped in blankets. The deck beneath you is solid, warm. Someone's offering tea, maybe brandy. You sit among dazed strangers barefoot, bruised, in pajamas and formal wear. No one speaks at first, and when they do, the words barely register. How many saved? How many gone? The numbers haven't formed yet, but you already know the answer. Most didn't make it. A quirky detail from this moment. One survivor tried to light a cigarette and his fingers broke. They were too stiff from the cold. Another wept, not for his lost fortune, but for the loss of his Newfoundland dog. History is full of those odd, fragile details that humanize catastrophe. You glance back out over the water. The Carpathia is collecting lifeboats now, gently reeling in survivors like flotsam. It's a solemn rescue, not a celebration. And somewhere out there beneath the waves is the Titanic silent, shattered, and beginning her slow, deep descent into legend. You're alive, but you don't feel lucky. You sit on the Carpathia's deck with a wool blanket around your shoulders and salt crusted in your eyebrows, surrounded by hundreds of equally stunned survivors, and it doesn't feel like you've been rescued. It feels like you've been pulled from a dream into something colder, heavier, more difficult to breathe in. The people around you aren't crying. Not yet. Most are simply staring at the sea, at the sky, at nothing in particular. A woman clutches a teacup without drinking. A boy whispers the name of someone no longer here. You try to move your fingers, and they're still stiff. Your legs ache, your head pulses, and your ears ring with the ghost of distant screams. The Carpathia crew rushes to help in any way they can. Their ship isn't meant for this many people, but they do their best. Passengers give up their cabins. Doctors tend to the frostbitten and the dying. The kitchens make hot soup non-stop. Blankets, dry clothes, and hot drinks appear like magic. And yet, none of it undoes what just happened. You're safe, but you're also not the same person who boarded the Titanic. Something's been scraped out of you and left behind in that frozen blackness. People start to talk. Whispered fragments of stories float through the air: who got out, who didn't, who jumped, who froze, who prayed. You hear about a woman who leapt from the deck with her baby, only to lose him in the water. You hear about a steward who refused to get into a lifeboat because there were still women on board. About a baker who survived hours in the ocean, possibly because he was drunk enough that the cold couldn't shock his body the same way. Historians still debate his story. Could alcohol really have helped him survive? No one knows for sure. But his name was Charles Joffin, and he swore he floated in the sea for hours and barely felt the cold. Just another strange thread in the tangled web of that night. Some passengers recognize each other, or think they do. They call names, scan faces, hoping someone they love made it aboard. Some get lucky, many don't. One young man wanders the deck asking every child he sees if they've seen his sister. He asks in 3 languages. No one answers. He keeps asking. By morning, the Carpathia has gathered the last of the lifeboats. Some were drifting miles apart. One was so far off course it took hours just to spot its lantern. When they're all finally together, the true size of the disaster begins to take shape. More than 2,200 souls were on Titanic when she left Southampton. Fewer than 710 are on the Carpathia. You do the math. And the press? They're already circling. When the Carpathia finally docks in New York, reporters swarm the docks like flies. They climb onto tugboats. They shout questions from peers. One even sneaks aboard the ship disguised as a crewman. You're still disoriented when the first flashbulbs go off in your face. Cameras click. Questions fly. What happened? How did you escape? Did you see the iceberg? Was the captain drunk? You don't have answers. You barely remember the questions. And then come the stories, some true, some warped. The survivors' accounts become headlines. Some are factual, others get embellished. There's an immediate hunger for heroes, villains, and saints. Did J. Bruce Ismay, chairman of White Star Line, really sneak into a lifeboat ahead of women and children? Some say yes, others say no. Historians still argue about his motives. He defended himself for years afterward, but public opinion rarely forgave him. People wanted sacrifice. They wanted nobility, and they weren't getting it from every corner. You hear names now. John Jacob Astor IV, the richest man on the ship, dead. Benjamin Guggenheim dead. Captain Smith dead. hundreds of crew dead, but also countless no-names, whole families gone, third-class passengers without relatives waiting on shore. Those losses don't make headlines. They just disappear into the sea, unclaimed. You get processed, given food, given questions, given paperwork, but no one can give you peace. You'll carry this night forever, whether you talk about it or not. Some survivors never speak of it again. Some talk of nothing else. Others write memoirs or letters or sit for interviews years later with tears that still haven't dried. One strange fact: several Titanic survivors ended up surviving other shipwrecks. Violet Jessop, a stewardess, survived not just the Titanic, but also the Britannica sister ship that sank during World War I. It's almost cartoonish, but true. Sometimes fate just loops the same horror on a repeat reel. And here's the thing about the Titanic: it wasn't just a shipwreck. It was a symbol, a rupture, a shattering of a belief system. Before it sank, people believed in progress, in engineering as salvation. The Titanic was modernity incarnate. Bigger, better, faster, untouchable. And then down it went, dragging with it not just lives but confidence. The world didn't feel quite as safe after the 15th of April, 1912. You get off the Carpathia eventually. Maybe you're met by family, maybe not. Maybe you wander New York in borrowed shoes and a stranger's coat, half ghost, half headline. The world continues, but you don't. Not entirely. You've seen something it was never meant to show you, that even the grandest vessels, with their luxury and steel and fanfare, are still just things. And things sink. A week later, a memorial service is held. Black armbands, newspapers with full-page obituaries. Conspiracy theories begin immediately. Was the Titanic doomed from the start? Were their warnings ignored? Were the flares the right color? Why weren't the lifeboats filled? Questions spiral. Historians still argue about nearly every stage of the disaster. How fast the ship was traveling, whether the steel was brittle, how many binoculars were available, why the lookout didn't see the iceberg sooner. The list is long, and the answers rarely simple. But none of that changes what you saw, what you felt. That salt, that cold, that darkness pressing in as the lights died. You remember the woman who handed her child up into a lifeboat and never followed. The man who tipped his hat as he stayed behind. The band, still playing while the sea crept up their ankles. You try to sleep, but in your dreams, you're always floating. Time doesn't feel the same after a disaster. Every day you wake up, it's as if some part of your mind is still drifting somewhere in the cold water, ears ringing with violin notes and screams. Your body walks through crowds, your lips speak when prompted, but your soul lags behind, caught between the slanting deck and the black horizon. Even now, weeks later, when you hear the distant clang of a bell or the hiss of steam escaping a pipe, your spine stiffens. It's not rational, but trauma rarely is. You didn't just survive. The Titanic you became one of its ghosts. Back on land, people want to know everything. Survivors become instant celebrities, interviewed and photographed as if surviving made you glamorous. But you know the truth. Survival wasn't noble. It was random. It was luck, chaos, timing. The wrong decision made 30 seconds later could have meant your name being etched on a marble plaque instead of listed in a newspaper column beside the word rescued. That fact doesn't go away. It lingers. It presses on your shoulders when you lie in bed and wonder why you lived when so many didn't. As investigations begin, you're summoned, perhaps even reluctantly, to give testimony. You sit in formal halls with chandeliers and polished benches, recounting what you remember while stenographers click away with typewriters. You tell them where you were when the iceberg struck, what you saw on the decks, how the lifeboats were loaded, who shouted, who froze, who led, who didn't. And through all of it, you notice something strange. Not everyone remembers the same story. One man swears the iceberg hit the port side. Another insists it was starboard. A woman claims the band played a ragtime tune at the very end. Another says it was silent. Someone testifies they saw the ship break in half. The official report says it sank intact. Historians still argue about that moment, the actual breakup of the Titanic. It wasn't until the wreck was found decades later that the evidence confirmed what so many survivors had insisted all along. The ship had indeed snapped in two, but back then, nobody wanted to believe it. That kind of destruction felt too savage, too complete. too humiliating. And humiliation, yes, that's something you see again and again in these hearings. The ship's owners, the designers, the officers who made it out alive, they all walk a tightrope of public scrutiny, especially Jay, Bruce Ismay. His presence in a lifeboat causes outrage. He tries to explain, to defend himself, but the narrative is already cemented. He was a coward, a rich man who leapt while poorer men drowned. Was it fair? Historians debate it to this day, but public perception didn't need proof, just a villain. Others are cast as heroes. Captain Smith, who went down with the ship though no one saw it directly. Thomas Andrews, who helped evacuate passengers until the end. The band, of course, whose final notes became myth. There's comfort in those stories. People cling to them. But you, the survivor, you know how messy it really was. How chaotic. How nothing fit into tidy categories of courage and cowardice. In the months following the disaster, memorials spring up. Names are engraved. Statues are raised. Fundraisers are held for the widows and orphans of the crew, many of whom were lost with barely any pay. A curious detail here. Crew members who died forfeited their wages from the moment the ship sank. That's right. Unless they survived, their families received nothing beyond the cost of a final paycheck, ending the 15th of April at 2:20 a.m. It's cold. It's bureaucratic. It's painfully typical. And what about the ship itself? Titanic was hailed as unsinkable, not because it was literally indestructible, but because it featured watertight compartments that could, in theory, contain flooding. The fatal flaw? Those compartments didn't go all the way up. Like a row of ice cube trays, if you tip it too far, water spills from one to the next. That's exactly what happened. The ship didn't fail because she was weak. She failed because the confidence behind her design outran the realities of nature. You learn things you didn't know, on board, like how Titanic received multiple iceberg warnings that day. 6 messages, in fact. Some were delivered to the bridge. Others never made it past the radio room, which was busy sending passenger telegrams. Historians still argue whether the radio operators were at fault, or whether the system itself was flawed, more focused on luxury communication than safety. You also discover that the Californian, a nearby ship, was only about 10-20 miles away that night, close enough to see Titanic's flares. But they didn't come. The Californian's radio was shut down for the night. Its crew saw lights, thought they were seeing distress signals, but not everyone agreed. Debates flared on board. Nothing happened. That inaction haunts you more than the iceberg. You wonder how many more might have lived had that ship acted. Another tragedy, inside the tragedy. Eventually you return to life, or try to. Some survivors go back to sea. Others never set foot on a ship again. A few even change their names, move to other countries, and vanish from public memory altogether. The trauma is too much. Talking about it doesn't help. It makes it worse. So they walk away from it all, start over, pretend it never happened. You might be tempted to do the same. Or maybe you write, or talk, or sit with other survivors, and share the things no one else understands. You visit a friend who also survived. Together, you talk about the sounds, the groan of the hull, the clatter of deck chairs tumbling into water, the silence that followed. You compare memories like puzzle pieces, wondering if either of you is remembering it right. One night, she says, "I still dream about the lights flickering." You nod. So do you. Your own family, if they're still around, tiptoe around the subject. Some are grateful, some don't know what to say, some want you to just move on, as if that's possible. You try. You get a job. You go for walks. You smile when someone offers you tea. But sometimes, when a train whistles, or a glass shatters, or someone says, "unsinkable," as a joke, your hand tightens around nothing, and your breath shortens. The Titanic was more than a ship. It was an age in steel, form confident, opulent, indifferent to warnings, and when she went down, she took more than lives. She marked the end of an era. You carry that mark with you. Months pass, then years. People stop asking questions so urgently, and the world shifts its focus. New inventions appear. Wars brew on distant horizons. But for you, the night Titanic sank is always nearby, just beneath the surface of every ordinary day. Sometimes it slips into your mind unexpectedly when you're standing on a sidewalk during a rainy night and a horn echoes in the fog, or when a waiter at a cafe casually says, "We're unsinkable here." Not knowing those words make your blood run cold. You don't correct them. You just nod and smile, and carry that silent reminder with you like an invisible scar. Meanwhile, the myths multiply. The Titanic becomes more than a disaster. It becomes a story people tell over candlelit dinners, a metaphor for arrogance, a ghost ship for the modern age. The newspapers continue to publish retrospectives, anniversary specials, dramatic sketches of the iceberg, the lifeboats, the band, and with every retelling, you notice the lines between reality and legend blur. You were there. You remember how loud it was, how dark. But now people talk about it like it was a fable. I heard they had enough lifeboats, but people just didn't use them. Didn't the captain speed up on purpose? Wasn't there a cursed mummy on board? Yes, that one gets repeated a lot, especially in parlours and dinner parties, where people like their tragedies served with a scoop of superstition. Here's the odd truth. There was a rumour about a cursed Egyptian artefact in the cargo hold, a sarcophagus lid, supposedly carrying a curse that doomed any ship it sailed on. But historians still argue whether such an object even existed, let alone sailed on Titanic. Most records say no, but people love a mystery. The idea of a cursed relic wreaking vengeance from beyond the grave is more digestible than the cold reality of human error and institutional failure. It's easier to blame a mummy than corporate greed or poor safety standards. You come across articles that try to explain the sinking with numbers, physics, metallurgy. They talk about steel quality, expansion joints, brittle rivets. One report claims the Titanic's steel became more brittle in cold water, making the hull more susceptible to damage. Another study debates the quality of the iron rivets, suggesting they failed under pressure. Yet others argue that no material, no matter how strong, could have withstood the sheer force of that iceberg impact at such high speeds. You read them all. They don't bring peace. They bring math. Still, the facts matter. They anchor you when memory becomes slippery. You remember how the officers didn't have binoculars because the key to the locker was accidentally taken off the ship by a reassigned officer in Southampton. You remember how Captain Smith received multiple iceberg warnings but didn't slow down. You remember the Morse lamp signals between ships that night confused, unanswered, ineffective. Small missteps, each forgivable on their own, but catastrophic together. A perfect storm of oversights. You wonder sometimes how the world might have changed if Titanic had made it safely to New York. It was carrying millionaires, aristocrats, artists, and immigrants. Deals would have been signed. Futures would have shifted. But instead, the ship became a monument to loss. The modern world was forced to confront the fragility of its own pride. Out of the wreck came the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea. Lifeboats for all passengers became law. Wireless operators were required to monitor radios around the clock. Ice patrols were established to chart dangerous waters. The loss made future travel safer, but the price was unbearable. You return to the sea once years later. You board a smaller vessel for a coastal trip. It's a calm, sunny afternoon, and yet your palms sweat as soon as you hear the engines hum. The vibration underfoot, the same low rumble you once mistook for reassurance, unnerves you. You grip the rail tighter than necessary. A crewman jokes about how modern ships couldn't possibly sink. You don't reply. You just look out over the water, which shimmers and sparkles and conceals everything. You know what lies beneath the surface. You've felt it. You've heard it. Others from the Titanic speak publicly. Some publish memoirs. Some go on lecture tours. Others, like you, avoid the spotlight. You write down your account once, in a notebook no one else has seen. It's not poetic. It's not for publication. It's raw and plain and unpolished, because the truth doesn't need decoration. It just needs to be remembered. There's one particular moment that still wakes you at night. Not the iceberg, not the sinking. It's the moment in the lifeboat when you looked back and saw nothing. Just sea. No more ship. No more sound. Just the endless quiet. That's when it felt real. That's when you realized you were completely alone in a world that had just changed. You remember someone in your lifeboat breaking the silence by asking, "What happens now?" No one answered. No one could. It was too soon. Too vast. You think about the lifeboats themselves, sometimes their names, their numbers. Boat 6, where Margaret Molly Brown tried to convince the crew to go back and rescue people. Boat 14, the only one that did. The collapsible boat's wooden bottoms, canvas sides, flimsy but vital. Some floated upside down. Some drifted for hours before being found. Each one its own floating fragment of that fractured night. And what of the ship itself? In 1985, when Titanic was finally discovered on the ocean floor, split in two and buried in sediment, the world collectively gasped. You didn't. You already knew she was down there, curled in the dark like a sleeping leviathan. You'd seen her sink in real time. The photos were just proof of what your bones already remembered. You meet other survivors now and then, at gatherings, at memorials. You trade looks more than words. There's a mutual understanding, a shared silence that binds you tighter than any family reunion. You don't need to say it aloud. You were there. You know. Sometimes a child or grandchild asks you what it was like. You always pause. You always consider softening the truth. But eventually, you speak. Not because you want to relive it, but because you know history is fragile. Memories die, and the only thing colder than the North Atlantic is forgetting. You tell them the lights flickered. You tell them the ship broke. You tell them that even in the most elegant of rooms, the ocean makes no exceptions. You grow older, but the story never does. It stays frozen, preserved like the wreck 2 miles beneath the surface, untouched by time even as you accumulate its weight. When people find out you were there, their reactions range from curiosity to disbelief. Some lean in, as if your words will unlock some secret they couldn't find in books. Others simply go quiet, unsure whether to offer sympathy or awe. But you're not looking for either. You don't talk about Titanic for applause. You talk because silence is heavier. You talk to keep the cold at bay. Occasionally, you meet someone who thinks it's all overblown. It was just a shipwreck, they say. Boats sink. You don't argue. You just nod. Let them believe that. Let them reduce it to numbers and dates and a faded photo of an iceberg. You know better. You know what it means to feel a world collapse under your feet, to be part of something too massive for words, too cruel for logic. Decades go by. The world changes. The horse-drawn carriages that rolled beside Titanic's berth in Southampton are replaced by cars, then buses, then jets. People walk on the moon. Radios become televisions. Telephones shrink into pockets. But Titanic never fades. It resurfaces again and again in documentaries, museums, books, and eventually, Hollywood. You sit in a dark theatre, decades after the fact, and watch actors walk corridors that look exactly like the ones you once paced in confusion. The set is uncanny. The dresses, the menus, the wallpaper identical. You know because you lived it. When the iceberg appears on screen, your body tenses. Your hands tighten on the seat arms. You don't expect tears, but they come anyway, unwelcome and slow. Not because the film is sad, but because it reminds you that the tragedy lives on in strangers' imaginations. It's still happening, again and again, in the flicker of a projector, in the soft hum of surround sound. They got some of it right, not all, but enough to make your heart ache. And the questions return. People want to know more. Did it really tilt that way? Was the music real? Did people truly refuse to get in the boats? Yes. Yes to all of it. And more. They never film the smell of the ship, the polish and sweat and coal dust. They never quite capture the eerie calm between the screams. That's the part that stays with you. The silence. It's louder than any orchestra. You learn that artifacts are being pulled from the wreck. Porcelain dishes. Shoes. A perfectly preserved pocket watch. Stopped forever at 2:20 a.m. Some people think it's wrong to disturb the site, to turn a grave into a gallery. Others believe that preserving the past is a form of honor. Historians still argue over where to draw the line. You don't know the answer. All you know is that somewhere out there, under all that pressure and darkness, lies the bed you slept in, the hallway you ran through, the railing you held as the ship tipped skyward. Sometimes you imagine what the wreck looks like now, how the sea has eaten it, how rust has grown like moss across its hull, how the chandeliers have gone dark, the grand staircase collapsed, the velvet rotted away. It should terrify you, but strangely, it doesn't. There's something peaceful about it. Titanic has finally found silence, and in that silence, she's more honest than she ever was above the water. But above the water, the reckoning continues. You get asked what could have saved more lives. More lifeboats, sure. Slower speeds, better communication, iceberg patrols, all true. But there's a harder truth people don't like to hear. Titanic sank because of faith. Not in God, but in machines, in engineering, in human infallibility. She was supposed to be perfect. and so no one planned for her to fail. She wasn't built for failure, and neither were the people who ran her. That lesson echoes long after the last survivor's voice fades. It echoes in space missions, in skyscraper blueprints, in submarine dives. Safety, once an afterthought, becomes law. Every ship now has more lifeboats than it needs. Drills are mandatory. Communication is 24/7. It took a catastrophe to change the rules. And you were one of the ones who paid the price for that lesson. There's another detail people overlook. The ones who did survive, they carried the Titanic with them for the rest of their lives. They didn't just walk off the Carpathia and move on. Many suffered from survivor's guilt, nightmares, isolation. Some never felt comfortable on land again. One woman reportedly slept in a life jacket for weeks after arriving home. Another refused to unpack her suitcase, certain she'd be uprooted again. Trauma doesn't care about geography. It unpacks itself in every room you enter. You remember your cabin, the linens pulled taut, the mirrored wardrobe, the hum of life beneath your feet. You remember the steward who smiled as he carried your trunk. You never learned his name. He didn't survive. Most of the crew didn't. That fact still burns. They were there to serve, and they died serving. They guided passengers, calmed panicked children, carried the elderly. Many refused to board lifeboats because they believed their duty came first. Their names aren't etched into bronze on fancy memorials, but you remember them. You're one of the last now. You attend a centennial ceremony. It's quiet, respectful. You stand beside some descendants of passengers, some historians, some simply moved by the story. A bell tolls. A choir sings, "Nearer, my God, to thee." You close your eyes. You don't cry. You did that years ago. Now you just listen. They launch a wreath into the sea. You watch it float for a while, then drift away. It's not dramatic. It's gentle. That's the part that always surprises you. The Titanic didn't explode. It didn't scream. It just vanished. That quiet is what haunts you most. You walk away from the railing slowly. Someone asks you if you'd ever sail again. You shake your head. "I already have," you say. And that was enough for one lifetime. You return to your small room in a hotel by the harbour. The window overlooks the water. At night, the waves reflect the moonlight in that familiar silver shimmer. You lie back on the bed, eyes half closed, and you let the memory risen not to torment you, but to remind you. You were there, you survived, and you remember. And sometimes, memory is the strongest form of honour there is. Eventually, you stop talking about it as much. Not because the memory fades, it doesn't, but because there comes a point where the story is no longer yours alone. It belongs to the world now, scattered across bookshelves, etched in stone, rendered in film and replica. People line up to see a mock-up of the grand staircase you once climbed in disbelief. They marvel at the luxury, the excess, the tragedy, but you know what they don't see. They don't see the people who danced on that floor, who slept in those rooms, who screamed as water rose around their ankles. They don't hear the quiet click of shoes on polished floors just before panic sets in. They see history. You still hear it breathing. It's strange, isn't it? How a single night can become an entire lifetime's shadow. You remember little details that no one ever asks about. The way the china clattered during rough water on the second night. The steward who tied your tie because you never quite got the hang of formal wear. The way your shoes pinched slightly when the ship set sail but felt like anchors when you tried to run. These aren't things that make it into textbooks, but they're real. And you carry them quietly, like the last notes of a song only you can hum. Some days, you forget for a moment. You sit on a park bench or read a newspaper or sip lukewarm coffee in a diner, and you feel almost ordinary. And then you hear someone joke, "At least it's not as bad as the Titanic," followed by laughter. Harmless, light. You don't interrupt, but your stomach flips, and your mind drifts not to the sinking, but to the moments just before. That silence. That eerie calm that settled in when people still believed everything was fine. The kind of silence that masks disaster. There's a name people start using around this time, Titanic syndrome. A metaphor for the arrogance that precedes collapse. Governments, corporations, even individuals time someone insists they're invincible, someone else inevitably says, "Remember the Titanic." You don't mind that. If the story serves as a warning, maybe it redeems some small part of the loss. Maybe all those lives teach something after all. But still, You know that for many, Titanic remains a story of glamour, of lost luxury, of elegant endings. They forger maybe never knew that so many of the dead were not dining under crystal chandeliers or lounging on velvet settees. They were labourers, immigrants, children, families packed into third-class compartments, sleeping 4 to a room. Many of them never made it to the deck. Some never even made it out of their cabins. And that injustice sticks with you, always. The gate that delayed them, the lifeboats that left half empty, while entire families pounded on the walls below. The idea that survival was not based on virtue or strength, or even luck, but on the price of your ticket. Historians still argue whether crew intentionally kept third-class passengers back, or if confusion and the sheer size of the ship played the larger role. You remember those locked gates. You saw them. You pushed past one once, didn't you? You remember the feel of the metal, cold under your palm. You remember shouting. You remember being ignored. It never leaves you, that feeling that even in the moment of greatest human desperation, people still thought in terms of rank. Who should go first? Who was more worthy? The water didn't care, but the people did. You keep a few mementos in a drawer. A cufflink from your pocket, still slightly tarnished. A folded menu from the second-class dining room, damp at the edges. A letter you never mailed, written on Titanic stationery. You found it later, still tucked into your coat when they hauled you from the lifeboat. You read it sometimes, just to hear the voice of your former self, the one who thought the world was stable, predictable, buoyant. And then one day, you find yourself at sea again, not by choice. You're traveling with family, they insisted, said it would be different this time. And it is. The ship is smaller, the lifeboats are plenty, the safety instructions are read out loud and followed by drills. The crew takes everything seriously. You notice every detail. You inspect every door. You note the nearest exits and check the radio room when no one's looking. It's not paranoia, it's memory. You walk the deck at night. The stars overhead are bright and clear, just as they were all those years ago. And then, just for a second, you hear music. Soft, maybe from a lounge somewhere below, a violin perhaps, and your heart skips. You lean over the railing, looking into the black water, and you remember it all. The sound of the hull twisting, the final groan of steel, the rush of cold water against your ankles, the cries that faded to whispers, the silence after. You stay there a while, letting it wash over you, not to haunt, but to honor. You whisper a name or two, names you've never forgotten. When you return home, you write again. Not just for yourself this time, for the record, for the memory. You write the names of those who died and those who lived. You write about the baker who floated, the band who played, the child who clutched her doll all the way into the boat, the young man who gave up his seat so someone else could live. You don't write to dramatize, you write to remember. And you end the letter with something no one ever puts in the films. You write about what it means to be after, to walk through a world that sees you as a symbol when you're just someone who didn't drown. You write, survival is not glory, it is obligation, to remember, to speak, to feel. Years later, someone finds that letter. They read it in a museum. Visitors walk past displays of teacups and broken china and shoes, and they pause before your words. Maybe they see more clearly after that. Maybe they remember the water wasn't just cold, it was filled with people, with stories. And you, sitting in a quiet room by a window, know your story is almost done. But not quite. Not until it's told all the way through. There's something strange about outliving history. You spend your days surrounded by people who only know the Titanic as a name, a ship, a myth. For them, it's a story wrapped in velvet and tragedy, distant and stylized. But for you, it's tactile, sensory, close. You remember the pitch of the deck as it rose under your feet, the salt that dried on your lips, the way your fingernails cracked from the cold. You can still feel the raw friction of rope against your skin, the heaviness of wool when it's soaked, and the way your breath came in shards, not air. For you, Titanic is not a monument. It's a scar that still pulses beneath the surface. By now, most of the other survivors are gone, their voices stilled, their memories handed over to archives and historians. The world treats them as relics, symbols, data points. But you remember their faces, their laughter on the promenade deck, the way they clinked teacups or stumbled down narrow corridors. You remember Small Thing Show one man used to sing under his breath while polishing boots, how a stewardess would sneak sugar cubes to crying children. Those details don't appear in museum captions. They only live in you. Sometimes, you sit by your window and look out at the ocean. Not the same ocean, of course, but any sea will do. The rhythm of waves, the scent of brine, the way sunlight dances on the surface, it always brings it back. And not just the sinking, everything. The majesty of the ship, the elegance of the upper decks, the brass polished to a golden shine, the sensation of being aboard something too big to fail. You can still hear the chime of the ship's bells marking the hours. You can still feel the strange thrill that came with being part of something grand and new. But grandeur meant nothing when the hull cracked open. The ocean didn't care that you had danced to violins or slept beneath embroidered linen. The water was democratic in its cruelty. It reached for everyone equally rich and poor, young and old, joyful and anxious. You think about that often, how every human effort to separate, to categorize, dissolved the moment the ship met the iceberg. The compartments didn't matter. The meal plans didn't matter. Only who could reach the deck, who could find a place in the boats, who could float. Historians still debate what really doomed the Titanic. Was it pride? Negligence? Poor engineering? An unlucky course through an unusually ice-laden sea? You've heard every theory. You've read them all. Even the wild ones, the cursed mummy, the coal fire weakening the hull, the supposed switch of Titanic with her sister ship, Olympic. They spiral out into conspiracies, half-truths, and technical jargon. But you know the truth is simpler and more terrifying. People didn't believe it could happen, and so they didn't prepare for it. The irony, of course, is that the ship was supposed to represent the future, the pinnacle of progress. Electric elevators, telegraphs, water heaters, refrigerated cargo rooms. You remember seeing the electric lights in the corridors and marveling at how modern it all felt. For a moment, Titanic seemed like proof that humanity had mastered the elements. But she wasn't the future. She was a monument to the past, to a world that valued opulence over caution, image over infrastructure. And when she went down, she took that world with her. The aftermath shaped you. You never stepped onto another ship without counting lifeboats first. You never sat through a dinner without thinking how it might be your last. You grew careful in ways others didn't understand. You carried extra scarves, extra matches, a list of names and addresses pinned inside your coat. You always faced the door. You always learned the layout of a building before you slept in it. Trauma rewires you. It makes everything a potential exit route. But the trauma wasn't just about survival. It was about guilt. You still see facesones you never saw again after that night. A woman in a blue shawl who helped you up the stairs. A young boy with a tin whistle who offered you a bite of hard biscuit. A man who gave you his seat in the dining hall. None of them made it. You did. You don't know why. And no answer has ever felt good enough. You tried to forget, once. Closed the door on that part of your past. Refused interviews. Burned letters. Moved inland. Far from harbours. But forgetting isn't peace. It's erosion. Eventually, you realize that memory painful, heavy, sometimes unbearably is also honour. So you began to write. Not a book, not for publication, just pages, notes, sentences scratched into margins, fragments that helped you piece together not what happened, but what it meant. Somewhere in a dusty trunk, there's a photo of you standing on the deck before the ship left port. You're younger, your collar slightly crooked, your smile hesitant. You didn't know then what waited ahead. You were full of dreams. Everyone was. Some wanted new lives in America. Others were returning from European tours. A few were just chasing adventure. All of them had plans, but the ocean had different ones. And now, all these years later, you still carry pieces of that voyage. When you hear a cello, you think of the band. When you hear a foghorn, you flinch. When someone mentions first class, you remember the stark contrast between the smoking room and the third-class bunks. But you also remember kindness, the shared blanket, the hand that pulled you into the lifeboat, the woman who sang softly while the ship tilted, just to keep the children calm. Humanity did not sink with the Titanic. In some ways, it surfaced. You don't call yourself a hero. You know better. Heroes made sacrifices. Some stood aside at the railings. Some handed over coats and life jackets. Some gave their last words with calm and grace. You were not brave. You were spared. but you have tried to make your life mean something because of that. You've carried stories forward. You've whispered names. You've corrected the record when others told it wrong. And sometimes, in the quietest hours before dawn, you let yourself go back, just for a moment. You see the stars above the Atlantic, the glow of the ship's lights against the waves, the way the water looked just before it all went wrong. It was beautiful. It was enormous. It was doomed. And you were there. The final years of your life come gently. You feel them not as a decline, but as a soft settling, like the quiet hush after snowfall, or the moment just before a candle gutters out. You spend more time in your chair by the window, sipping tea that's grown weaker over the years, wrapped in a shawl that smells faintly of lavender and old wood. When you speak now, people lean in. Not because your voice has faded, it has, but because your words carry weight. You've become, in their eyes, a living relic, a rare witness to something that has long since passed from the world into legend. They ask what it was like to watch history sink beneath you. You try to answer, but sometimes you wonder if they're ready to hear the truth. You think often about the night she went down, but now, it's less the panic and more the stillness that holds you. You remember the taste of the air clean, sharp, laced with salt and coal smoke. You remember how the stars scattered above you like shattered crystal. You remember how the sea, when not broken by screams or lifeboats, lay flat and gleaming, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The ship, magnificent even in her death throes, slipped away with a grace that didn't match the horror of it all. That image clings to you, the towering stern rising into the sky like a cathedral before vanishing, pulled backward into black water. Now, on quiet evenings, you sometimes close your eyes and imagine walking the decks again. You remember where the scuffs marked the wooden planks near the stern, where a boy had tossed a ball until his mother called him to supper. You can still trace the route from the second-class library to the promenade. You can almost feel the velvet of the dining room chair, hear the clink of cutlery, the muffled trill of polite conversation. The memories remain vivid, not because they were extraordinary, but because they were stolen, frozen forever in time. The world has kept the Titanic alive in ways you never could have imagined. There are postage stamps, commemorative coins, museum exhibitions, entire sections of history books dedicated to that one night. You've been to some of them, wheeled carefully between displays. You've seen your own name typed on glass placards. You've watched strangers peer at it, read your age at the time, and shake their heads. You're a curiosity now, something rare and strange and maybe a little magical, the last thread to a sunken world. One time, a child approached you at an event no older than 8, maybe 9. She stood in front of your chair, wide-eyed, and asked, "Did it really happen like the movie?" You smiled and told her, "No, darling, it was worse." But you softened it with a story about the lifeboat lantern show they bobbed like stars on the sea, and how they made you feel like you weren't entirely alone. The truth was more complicated, of course, but you gave her what she could carry. Some stories must be rationed, even when they burn in the chest. You sometimes receive letters from students, researchers, distant relatives, even strangers. They thank you for surviving, for speaking, for keeping the story alive. You read them slowly, savouring the careful penmanship or the hesitant typed words. Some include drawings crayon ships surrounded by scribbled waves. Others send poems. A few ask questions you'll never answer, too personal or painful or absurd. But all of them remind you that you didn't just survive, you bore witness. There's a particular phrase that appears in many of the letters: "You are a piece of living history." It's meant kindly, but it never sits quite right, because you never wanted to be history. You wanted to be a passenger, a traveller, a dreamer, like everyone else who boarded that ship thinking they were heading towards something grand. You didn't ask to become a footnote, a headline, a survivor, but history chose you anyway. And what of your dreams? You've had so many since then, not just while sleeping, but waking ones too. You married, or perhaps you didn't. You raised children, or maybe you taught others children instead. You worked. You laughed. You cried over things unrelated to ice and steel and freezing water. You had a life, a full one that outlived the ship that tried to end it. And in its quiet rhythm, you honoured the dead, not by clinging to grief, but by continuing. That, too, is survival. One afternoon, you receive a package. Inside is a small glass bottle with seawater taken from over the Titanic's wreck site. It's labelled, carefully sealed. accompanied by a note from a marine researcher who once heard you speak. The bottle is heavy in your hand, heavier than it should be. You stare at it for a long time, then place it on your shelf near the old menu and the cufflink and the fading photograph. It feels right there, like a circle gently closed. The days grow shorter. The sun doesn't rise as high as it used to. Your body softens, slows. The things that once seemed sharp now feel rounded at the edges. Memory, pain, fear. But the story remains sharp. Your voice is quieter, but your presence still commands rooms. People still pause when you begin to speak. They still listen when you say, "It wasn't about the ship. It was about the people." Don't forget the people. Sometimes, in dreams, you return to the deck. You walk its length, alone. The air is still. The sea is calm. There is no panic, no cold, no screaming, only light. You pause near the bow and look out at the vast nothing ahead. It is not frightening. It is peaceful, as if the ship, for once, is not bound for ruin but drifting toward rest. You know your own journey is nearing its end, but there's no fear in that. You've already stared down the dark. You've already been under stars at the edge of the world, listening to steel groan and hearts break. Everything after that has been a kind of grace, a borrowed time. When the day finally comes, you are ready. You lie beneath warm blankets, a hand in yours, perhaps. You feel the breath slow. You hear distant music, real or imagined. It doesn't matter. You close your eyes. You see the lanterns glowing softly. You see the lifeboat dipping gently into the dark. You feel the deck beneath you still, the water calm. You are not afraid. You made it. Now, take a deep breath. Let the rhythm of the waves settle in your mind, soft and slow. Picture that ocean, not the chaos, not the cold, but what came after the stillness. The wide black sea, calm as polished stone, lit only by the glow of stars and the bobbing lanterns of distant lifeboats. Let yourself float there, safe now, held above the depths by memory and moonlight. You survived more than a sinking. You survived the silence that followed, the long years, the questions, the weight of remembering. But tonight, there's no need to carry any of that. You can let it drift, like the debris that once scattered across the water, like names murmured in the dark and released into the wind. The ship is gone. The voices have faded. But you are still here, breathing, resting, drifting slowly into sleep, like a lifeboat on a windless sea. The stars overhead are clear. The night is quiet. There are no icebergs, no alarms, no rushing water, only breath, only warmth, only rest. So close your eyes now. Feel your limbs soften. Let your heart beat slow. Let go of the deck. Let go of the cold. You are safe. You are remembered. You are home. And if you listen carefully, in the hush of your own breath, you might just hear a violin playing far away. Not a dirge, not a warning, just a lullaby for those who float between then and now. Good night, traveller.